12,000 meters above Germany, February 1942. The Bf-109's cockpit glass frosted over. Ice crystals spiderwebbed across the instrument panel. Oberleutnant Rudolf Klein's gloved hand hovered over a toggle switch marked GM1. He'd never used it before. The supercharger screamed, engine temperature spiked. The Daimler-Benz DB605A wheezed in the thin air, starving for oxygen that didn't exist at this altitude. Below, American B-17s droned in formation, untouchable, smug in their high-altitude sanctuary. His wingman had already turned back. Engine couldn't breathe. Klein was alone. He flipped the switch. Behind his seat, compressed air hissed through steel lines. 115 liters of chilled nitrous oxide, stored at -40 degrees Celsius in glass wool insulated tanks, surged forward. The liquid vaporized instantly as it hit the hot supercharger intake. Two brass jets, different bore sizes, atomized the chemical into the compressed airstream. The engine didn't roar. It screamed. Power exploded. 300 horsepower materializing from chemistry alone. The tachometer needle jerked right. Manifold pressure spiked beyond every placard limit. Klein's head snapped back against the headrest as the fighter clawed upward through air so thin it shouldn't support flight at all. 680 kilometers per hour at 12,000 meters. Faster than any piston fighter had ever flown at this altitude. The American formation grew larger in his reflector sight. But this is not a story about one pilot. This is about the invisible fuel behind the miracle. The system that let German fighters chase bombers into the stratosphere when every law of physics said their engines should quit. A system so powerful the Luftwaffe named it after Hermann Göring himself. A system born from desperation, rocket science, and one engineer's refusal to accept that air got too thin to fight in. GM1. Göring, Mischung. 1. The stuff pilots called laughing gas because nitrous oxide, the same chemical dentists use, was about to make Klein laugh at impossible odds, or kill him. The line between the two was measured in grams per second, injection rates, and whether the fuel mixture stayed rich enough to prevent detonation. Stay with this story, because what happened next changed aerial warfare forever, and almost no one outside the Luftwaffe knew it existed. Klein's finger tightened on the trigger. In 22 minutes his nitrous would run dry. The problem emerged over Britain in the summer of 1940, though German engineers didn't realize it yet. RAF bombers climbed higher. Not dramatically, a few hundred meters at a time, but enough. Enough that Bf-109 struggled to intercept them at combat power above 7,000 meters. The Daimler-Benz DB601 engine, magnificent at sea level, gasped for oxygen in the thin air. Superchargers could only compress so much. Beyond a certain altitude, power dropped catastrophically. Standard physics, immutable. Or so they thought. By autumn, the Reich Air Ministry faced a strategic nightmare. Allied reconnaissance aircraft photographed Germany from altitudes German fighters couldn't sustain combat at. The Spitfire's Merlin engine, running faster and hotter than German engines, maintained power where the DB601 faltered. The British accepted shorter engine life. In war, fighters rarely survived long enough for that to matter, but Germany had built an air force around the 109's airframe. Too small to accept the larger DB603 engine. Too late to redesign everything. The Messerschmitt's fuselage, compact, efficient, had become a prison. The engineers needed a solution that didn't require tearing apart the entire aircraft. That's when Otto Lutz, working at the Deutsche Forschungsanstalt für Luftfahrt, proposed something borrowed from his rocket research: chemical oxidizers, not for propulsion, for breathing. Aircraft engines suffocated at altitude because air pressure dropped. Less pressure meant less oxygen per cylinder stroke. Less oxygen meant less power. Simple, brutal, physical law. But what if you added oxygen? Not from the air, from a bottle. Lutz studied oxidizers used in liquid fuel rockets, compounds that released oxygen during combustion. Most were viciously unstable. Chlorine trifluoride would corrode through steel. Pure oxygen was explosive. Hydrogen peroxide was manageable, but gave inconsistent results. Nitrous oxide, though, N2O, laughing gas, non-toxic, stable at room temperature, already proven in Robert Goddard's American rocket patents from 1914. When heated during combustion, it decomposed progressively, not explosively, releasing oxygen exactly when and where the engine needed it. Better still, the decomposition absorbed heat, cooling the intake charge. Denser air, more power. The chemistry was elegant, making it work at 40,000 feet in combat, in a fighter designed before anyone imagined this problem, would require engineering that hadn't been invented yet. Hermann Göring, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, seized on the concept with characteristic grandiosity. He wanted his name on the miracle. Göring-Mischung, Göring's mixture, GM1. Testing began in late 1940 on the DB601N engine. Early results were staggering: 25 to 30% power increase above rated altitude, 300 horsepower from a bottle. But the system weighed 100 kilograms when filled. It lasted maybe 22 minutes before running dry. And if the fuel mixture wasn't perfectly balanced with the nitrous injection rate, the engine would detonate itself in seconds. Production teams faced an impossible deadline. The high-altitude war was already here. The first prototype tank exploded during ground testing in January 1941. Not dramatically. No fireball. The steel cylinder simply ruptured under pressure, spraying nitrous oxide across the test stand in a freezing white cloud. Engineers scrambled back expecting fire. None came. N2O doesn't burn by itself, but the lesson was immediate. Storage pressure was the enemy. Otto Lutz's team had initially tried storing nitrous oxide as a compressed gas at high pressure, 120 to 150 atmospheres, the same way industrial gases were handled. But the weight penalties were catastrophic. Thick steel walls, heavy regulators. The system would have added 200 kilograms to an airframe already straining under every modification. The breakthrough came from rocket research. Cool it. At minus 40 degrees Celsius, nitrous oxide liquefied with minimal pressure. Liquid was denser than gas. Same amount of oxidizer, half the volume, quarter the weight. And the liquid state offered an unexpected bonus. When injected into the hot supercharger intake and instantly vaporized, the phase change absorbed enormous amounts of heat. Additional charge cooling, denser intake air, free power from thermodynamics. But keeping nitrous liquid at minus 40 degrees in an unheated aircraft at 12,000 meters, where ambient temperature already hovered near minus 50, presented new problems. The slightest heat leak and the liquid would boil off. Wasted oxidizer, lost pressure, mission failure. Glass wool insulation, borrowed from cryogenic research. Wrapped around cylindrical aluminum tanks, the insulation maintained temperature for hours. Not perfectly. Some boil-off was inevitable. Filled tanks vented slowly through pressure relief valves. Ground crews learned to fill the system immediately before takeoff. Leave a GM1-equipped fighter sitting at readiness for 6 hours and half the nitrous would be gone. The injection system itself demanded surgical precision. 2 brass jets, different bore diameters, mounted directly in the supercharger intake. Small jet, 60 grams per second. Large jet, 100 grams. Both jets together, 150 grams. 3 power settings. Pilots controlled it with a simple toggle. Small, large, or both. No graduated throttle, on or off, because the fuel flow had to increase proportionally. More oxygen demanded more fuel. Get the ratio wrong and the engine ran lean. Cylinder temperatures would spike. Pistons would soften, then melt. Catastrophic failure in seconds. The DB605's fuel injection system received a parallel modification. Additional fuel jets that activated automatically when GM1 engaged. 60 grams of nitrous required X amount of extra fuel. 150 grams required more. The system had to be foolproof. It rarely was. Early test pilots reported violent backfires when engaging GM1 too aggressively. The fuel mixture couldn't respond fast enough. Engineers added a flow regulator that ramped up nitrous injection over 5 seconds instead of instantly. That solved the detonation problem. It created a new one. 5 seconds at combat speeds meant the enemy could see you coming. Wind tunnel tests at the Luftfahrtforschungsanstalt Hermann Göring proved the tanks couldn't survive in the wings. Airflow buffeting at 600 kilometers per hour would crack the glass wool insulation. Solution: mount the main tank behind the pilot's seat. Some variants used 2 smaller tanks in the port wing route instead. Installation required cutting into the fuselage, reinforcing structural frames, and rerouting high-pressure lines without interfering with control cables or fuel systems. Field workshops hated it. But by mid-1941, the system worked. Almost. August 1940. A Bf-109E-7Z of 2JG-1 engaged RAF reconnaissance Spitfires at 8,000 meters over the English Channel. Pilot report, Declassified 1947. Activated GM-1 at 7,800 meters. Engine response immediate and violent. Acceleration like emergency power but sustained. Closed distance to Spitfire in 40 seconds. Target appeared confused by pursuit angle. Claimed 1 destroyed. The Spitfire pilot survived. His after-action report is more revealing. Encountered 109 at Angels 26. Began evasive climb. Standard doctrine against 109s at altitude. Enemy fighter followed. Normally, they cannot maintain combat power above 25,000. This one accelerated. Impossible rate of climb. Breaking every performance envelope in the manual. Fear. That's what GM-1 delivered first, not kills. Fear. Allied pilots had learned to fight Bf-109s by understanding their limitations. Above 7,000 meters, the 109 lost power faster than the Merlin-powered fighters. Climb away. Make them chase. Watch them fall behind as their engines starved. GM-1 inverted that calculus. But the early systems were temperamental. Of the first 30 GM-1-equipped aircraft delivered to operational units in late 1940, 12 reported malfunctions within the first month. Injection nozzles froze. Pressure regulators failed. One pilot engaged the system at 6,000 meters, below the minimum activation altitude, and the sudden power surge overstressed the propeller gear reduction, shattering teeth and forcing an emergency landing. The DB601N engine could handle the extra power, barely, but only above 8,000 meters where manifold pressure naturally dropped low enough that the GM-1 boost didn't exceed structural limits. Below 8 kilometers, the system was dead weight. 100 kilograms of useless equipment. Pilots called it the high-altitude switch. Use it too low and the engine would destroy itself. Too high, above 13,000 meters, and even GM-1 couldn't save you from oxygen starvation in an unpressurized cockpit. The window was narrow. 8,000 to 13,000 meters. 22 minutes of boost. Enough to intercept 1 bomber formation. Maybe 2 if you were disciplined. After that, you were ordinary again. JG-1 began developing tactics specifically for GM-1-equipped aircraft. High cover. Climb to maximum altitude before engaging. Wait for Allied fighters to chase the lower formations, then dive through with Nitrous engaged. Speed and altitude combined into a single hammer blow. It worked. When it worked. When the system didn't freeze. When pilots remembered to turn it off before descending. When ground crews had filled the tanks properly. When the fuel mixture stayed balanced. The problem with introducing a complex system mid-war is that nobody has time to master it. Training was rushed. Manuals were vague. One pilot, caught in combat at 11,000 meters with GM-1 engaged, forgot to monitor his fuel state. The nitrous ran dry mid-engagement. Power dropped instantly. The DB605A suddenly running rich because the fuel jets were still delivering GM-1 levels of fuel without the corresponding oxidizer, flooded and quit. He bailed out over France, but the enemy didn't know that. From the Allied perspective, Bf-109s were suddenly appearing at impossible altitudes, accelerating like nothing they'd seen. Intelligence officers interviewed returning bomber crews. The reports were consistent. 109s at 35,000 feet. Sustained combat power. Faster than spec sheets allowed. Nobody in London believed it. The Luftwaffe had found something. But what? By February 1942, the Bf-109G1 entered production as the first variant designed from the ground up with GM-1 integration. Not an afterthought. not a field modification. Built for it, 167 G1s rolled off assembly lines between February and June 1942. Each received a pressurized cockpit, vertical armor plate sealing the rear canopy, small horn-shaped air intake above the supercharger for the compressor, silica gel capsules in the double-glazed windows to prevent condensation. At 13,000 meters, cockpit pressure remained equivalent to 8,000 meters. Pilots could function without oxygen masks. Briefly, the odd-numbered variants, G1, G3, G5, all carried GM1 as standard equipment. Even-numbered variants, G2, G4, G6, were unpressurized workhorses for lower-altitude combat. The Luftwaffe was segregating its fighter force by mission profile, high-altitude interceptors versus everything else. This created logistical nightmares, 2 different maintenance schedules, 2 different supply chains, 2 different tactical doctrines. JG-1 and JG-26 received the first operational G-1s for high-altitude squadrons, specifically tasked with intercepting Allied reconnaissance aircraft and high-flying bombers. But the weight penalty meant these aircraft were slower and less maneuverable at low altitude than standard G-2s. Commanders had to choose altitude or agility. The Reich Air Ministry's solution was brutal efficiency. Deploy GM-1 aircraft only where altitude mattered. Eastern Front, standard G-2s. The Russians rarely operated above 6,000 meters. Mediterranean, standard G-2s with tropical filters. North Africa was all low-level ground attack and bomber escort below 4,000 meters. But over Germany itself, defending against RAF high-altitude reconnaissance flights and the early American daylight raids, GM-1 aircraft became essential. Production numbers tell the story. 1942, 167 G1s built. 1943, production of GM-1 capable variants accelerates. G3 and G5 models enter service. Combined production exceeds 800 units. But here's the strategic irony. Just as GM-1 production peaked, combat altitudes began dropping. In 1943, the USAAF's daylight bombing campaign prioritized fighter escort at medium altitudes, 6,000 to 8,000 meters, where P-47 Thunderbolts could maintain formation with the bombers. The high-altitude war everyone predicted never fully materialized. Allied bomber doctrine shifted toward saturation raids with overwhelming fighter cover at altitudes where GM-1 offered minimal advantage. The system's limitations became glaring. 22 minutes of boost wasn't enough for extended patrol missions. The 100-kilogram weight penalty reduced climb rate and turning performance, critical in dogfights. And the constant evaporation problem meant aircraft couldn't maintain readiness for rapid scrambles. By the time ground crews received an alert, refilled the GM-1 tanks, and got the aircraft airborne, the enemy formation had already changed altitude or passed the intercept zone. Intelligence reports from captured Allied pilots added another complication. The British and Americans knew about GM-1 by mid-1943. Captured Bf-109 G1s were shipped to Farnborough for analysis. RA test pilots flew them at altitude with GM-1 engaged and documented everything. Power curves, injection rates, tank capacity, operational ceiling. Once the mystery dissolved, Allied tactics adapted. Forced German fighters to engage at lower altitudes where GM-1 was useless. Bait them into long chases that exhausted their nitrous supply. Then counterattack. By late 1943, Luftwaffe units began requesting the MW50 methanol water injection system instead, a different boost technology optimized for low to medium altitudes, where actual combat was happening. MW50 added power from sea level to 6,000 meters. More useful, more reliable. GM-1 equipped aircraft were quietly reassigned. High-altitude reconnaissance suppression, intercepting lone B-17s attempting photo runs above the bomber stream, specialized missions where 22 minutes of extreme altitude performance justified the compromises. But the strategic moment had passed. The aerial war had moved to altitudes where courage and numbers mattered more than chemistry. Rudolf Klein's vision narrowed to the gun sight. 12,300 meters. The altimeter needle trembled. Outside temperature, -52 Celsius. The plexiglass canopy had frosted completely except for the small, electrically heated section directly in front of his face. The B-17 formation, 9 aircraft in tight combat box, sat 800 meters above him and pulling away. Their contrails wrote chalk lines across the stratosphere. Klein's right hand moved from throttle to the GM1 toggle. Click. The transformation was not gradual. The DB605A didn't wind up smoothly like opening a throttle. The engine detonated into a new power regime. 300 horsepower materialized in 5 seconds. The fighter surged forward. Klein's helmet smacked the headrest despite the harness. Manifold pressure spiked to 1.42 atmospheres. The supercharger screamed at frequencies that made his teeth ache even through the leather helmet. Airspeed 640 kilometers per hour, at 12,000 meters. Impossible. The Fortress gunners saw him coming. Tracers arced down. 50 caliber rounds that looked lazy at this distance but moved faster than sound. Klein pushed the stick forward slightly, then yanked it back. The 109 porpoised through the tracer stream. 3 rounds punched through the port wing. Didn't matter. He was still accelerating. The GM1 gauge showed 90 liters remaining, 15 minutes. Maybe. The injection system was dumping 150 grams per second. Both jets open. Maximum boost. His fuel gauge unwound faster than seemed physically possible. The DB605A was drinking fuel and nitrous in quantities the designers had never intended for sustained operation. Cylinder head temperature, 420 degrees. Red line was 400. Klein ignored it. He pulled vertical. The BF-109, 3,100 kilograms with the GM1 system filled, climbed straight up like a rocket. The B-17s were still in front of him but now at his altitude. Same plane. The belly gunner opened fire. Klein saw muzzle flashes, felt impacts somewhere aft. Oil pressure fluctuated, still green. He fired. 1 second burst. The 20mm MG-151 cannon, mounted in the propeller hub, sent shells into the Fortress's No. 3 engine. Metal petals bloomed. Black smoke. The bomber dropped out of formation, nose heavy, spiraling down through its own contrail. But Klein's nitrous was bleeding away. 80 liters. 12 minutes. 2 more B-17s broke formation, trying to gain altitude. 1 dove. Standard doctrine against German fighters. At this altitude, diving was suicide for Klein. The GM1 system only worked above 8,000 meters. If he followed the diving bomber down, the power would cut off at 8 kilometers and he'd be an ordinary fighter again. Slow, vulnerable. He stayed high. The second B-17 tried to outclimb him. Its right cyclone radials, turbocharged for altitude, clawed for height. 1,900 horsepower per engine, 4 engines, but 70,000 pounds of airframe, bombs, and ammunition. Klein's fighter weighed 6,800 pounds. Physics chose sides. He caught the bomber at 12,900 meters. Range, 200 meters. Deflection angle, 15 degrees. The bomber's waist gunners were firing, but oxygen deprivation at this altitude slowed their reactions. Hypoxia set in above 12,000 meters without pressurization. The gunners were dying even as they fought. Klein fired again. This time he held the trigger down. 2 seconds. 20 rounds. The cannon recoil shook the entire aircraft. Shells stitched across the bomber's fuselage. The tail gunner's position disintegrated. Then something critical, fuel tank or oxygen system, ignited. The B-17 exploded. Not like in films. No fireball. At this altitude, with air this thin, combustion was weak and incomplete. The bomber simply came apart. Wings separated. Fuselage tumbled. Pieces fell in slow motion through the stratosphere, trailing debris. Klein banked away. GM1 gauge, 60 liters. 8 minutes remaining. His radio crackled. Another formation inbound. 15 kilometers south. Higher. 13,200 meters. He checked his oxygen supply. 7 minutes left in the bottle. At 13,000 meters, he'd last maybe 5 minutes before hypoxia made him combat ineffective. The pressurized cockpit bought time, but not much. The math was simple and cruel. He could chase them. Use the remaining nitrous. Maybe get one more kill before his oxygen ran out or the GM1 tanks went dry. Then he'd have to descend through Allied fighter cover with no advantage, no speed, and an engine about to quit from thermal stress. Or turn back now. Live to fight tomorrow. Klein turned west. Toward home. Fuel gauge, 35 liters. 20 minutes to the airfield at current consumption rate. If the engine didn't quit first. The physics of GM1 were simple. Making them work was not. Nitrous oxide, N2O, decomposes at approximately 600 degrees Celsius into nitrogen and oxygen. During engine combustion, temperatures exceed 1200 degrees. The N2O molecules broke apart, releasing oxygen exactly where the engine needed it. Inside the combustion chamber during the power stroke. But here's the engineering elegance. Normal air contains roughly 21% oxygen by volume. Nitrous oxide, when decomposed, yields approximately 33% oxygen by mass. Inject nitrous into the intake air, and you're effectively creating a richer oxygen atmosphere. More oxygen means more fuel can burn completely. More complete combustion means more power. At 12,000 meters, atmospheric pressure drops to approximately 19 kilopascals, less than 20% of sea level pressure. The DB605A's single-stage supercharger could compress intake air to maintain manifold pressure, but only to a point. Above 8,000 meters, even with the supercharger at maximum boost, the engine lost power progressively. GM1 changed the equation. The system didn't increase manifold pressure. It enriched the oxygen content of the air already being compressed. Think of it as artificial atmosphere. At 12,000 meters with GM1 engaged, the engine thought it was operating at 7,000 meters in terms of oxygen availability. The power gain was immediate, approximately 300 horsepower above rated altitude for the DB605A. But the thermodynamics were complex. When liquid nitrous oxide at -40 Celsius hit the hot supercharger intake at 200 degrees, it vaporized instantly. Phase change from liquid to gas absorbed approximately 90 kilojoules per kilogram. Tremendous cooling. The intake charge temperature dropped by 40 to 60 degrees. Colder air is denser. Denser air contains more molecules per cubic meter. More molecules means more mass flow through the engine. Additional power from charge cooling alone accounted for approximately 50 of the 300 horsepower gain. The rest came from oxygen enrichment. The injection system used two jets, 60 mm and 100 mm bore diameter. Small jet delivered 60 grams of nitrous per second. Large jet delivered 100 grams. Both jets together, 150 grams per second. Do the math. On 15 liters of liquid nitrous oxide at 0.9 grams per cubic centimeter equals approximately 103 kilograms of nitrous. At maximum flow rate, 150 grams second, the system lasted approximately 11 minutes. At minimum flow, 60 grams second, duration extended to 28 minutes. But nobody used minimum flow in combat. The fuel system had to compensate. The DB605A's baseline fuel consumption at combat power was approximately 120 liters per hour. With GM1 at maximum injection, fuel consumption jumped to 180 liters per hour. The fuel jets were mechanically linked to the GM1 activation switch. Turn on nitrous, fuel flow increased automatically. Get the ratio wrong, and catastrophic engine failure occurred in seconds. Too lean. Combustion temperatures exceeded piston material limits. Aluminum pistons softened at 650 degrees. Detonation, uncontrolled explosive combustion, would destroy pistons, crack cylinder heads, or shatter connecting rods. Too rich. Incomplete combustion created excessive carbon buildup and spark plug fouling. The engine would run rough, lose power, and eventually quit. The ideal mixture ratio, 14 parts air to 1 part fuel by mass. With nitrous enrichment, the air now contained extra oxygen, so fuel flow had to increase proportionally. Engineers calculated the exact fuel increase required for each GM1 flow rate through extensive dyno testing. On a test stand controlled conditions, it worked perfectly. In combat, at -50 degrees, with the aircraft pulling 6 G-turns and the engine already stressed from extended high-power operation, Maintaining perfect mixture ratio was nearly impossible. Pilots learned to monitor cylinder head temperature obsessively. If it spiked above 420 degrees with GM1 engaged, they had perhaps 10 seconds to reduce power or risk detonation. The system also created bizarre failure modes. If GM1 ran out mid-combat and the pilot didn't immediately reduce throttle, the fuel jets continued delivering GM1 level fuel flow into an engine now breathing normal air. Massively rich mixture, black smoke, fouled plugs, possible engine failure. If a nitrous line froze, glass wool insulation wasn't perfect, injection would stop but the fuel jets would keep flowing. Same result. If the pressure regulator failed, combat damage, manufacturing defect, extreme cold, the injection rate could spike unpredictably. Too much nitrous, not enough fuel, detonation. The WW2 was being asked to operate in regimes its designers never imagined, with a chemical injection system added as an afterthought. That it worked at all was remarkable. That it worked reliably enough for combat operations was miraculous. Hauptmann Werner Quast, 2nd JG1, December 1942. Letter to his wife, intercepted by Allied censors, Declassified 1963. The GM1 aircraft are killing us in ways that have nothing to do with the enemy. Yesterday, Lieutenant Fisher forgot to switch off the nitrous before descending. Engine seized at 6,000 meters. He bailed out, landed in a field outside Hanover. Broken leg, but alive. He was one of the lucky ones. The psychological burden of operating GM1-equipped aircraft was measured not in fear of enemy fighters, but in the constant mental accounting required to survive. Pilots tracked 6 critical parameters simultaneously. 1. Altitude, GM1 prohibited below 8,000 meters. 2. Nitrous remaining, average 15 minutes at combat flow. 3. Fuel state, consumption rate doubled with GM1 active. 4. Cylinder head temperature, detonation threshold was razor thin. 5. Oxygen supply, pressurized cockpit bought time, not immunity. 6. Enemy position, because all the above mattered only if you survived combat added variables. G-forces during violent maneuvers affected fuel and nitrous flow rates unpredictably. Negative G flight, nose-down dives, could interrupt injection entirely. The direct injection system of the WW2 handled negative G better than the Merlin's carburetor-fed engines, but GM1 added complications. One pilot reported that during a 6G sustained turn at 11,000 meters with GM1 engaged, the fuel pressure fluctuated and the engine momentarily cut out. Half-second of silence. Then it caught again. In combat, half a second is the difference between firing and being fired upon. The fear wasn't dramatic, it was erosive. Every mission became an exercise in risk management rather than combat flying. Engage too early, and you'd exhaust nitrous before reaching the enemy. Engage too late, and you'd be shot down before the system activated. Descend without deactivating GM1, and you'd destroy your own engine. Luftwaffe mechanics reported a different kind of stress. The GM1 system required refilling before every high-altitude sortie, but liquid nitrous oxide at minus 40 degrees was viciously cold. Handling lines froze to bare skin instantly. Frostbite was common. Worse, the constant venting during storage meant that ground crews often filled tanks that were already half empty from evaporation. Pilots would take off thinking they had 20 minutes of boost and discover mid-combat they had 8. Trust eroded. One mechanic's diary, recovered from a shot-down Bf-109G1 in France. The pilots blame us when the system fails. But how can we fill tanks properly when the nitrous arrives late, when we have no proper storage, when the compressor freezes in winter? They fly for 15 minutes. We work on these machines for 12 hours in minus 20 degrees. They get the glory. We get frostbite and accusations. The human cost extended to unexpected places. At 13,000 meters, even in a pressurized cockpit, pilots experienced hypoxia symptoms after 20 to 30 minutes. Narrowed vision, slowed reactions, euphoria, dangerous because it masked cognitive decline. Pilots didn't realize they were making fatal errors until it was too late. And the cold. God, the cold. Cockpit heating in the Bf-109 was inadequate at extreme altitude. Pilots wore electrically heated suits, but the connections were unreliable. One pilot described his feet going completely numb during a 40-minute high-altitude patrol. He landed, was extracted from the cockpit and couldn't walk. Frostbite. 3 toes amputated. For what? By late 1943, pilots questioned the value. The GM-1 system delivered spectacular performance in a very narrow altitude band, but most combat was happening elsewhere. Lower, faster, against overwhelming numbers of Allied fighters who didn't need chemical boost to dominate. Oberleutnant Klein, the pilot from our earlier combat sequence, survived the war. His post-war interview is revealing. GM-1 made us gods for 20 minutes. Then it made us targets. The weight penalty, the complexity, the constant worry. Was it worth it? I got 11 kills. 7 were at altitudes where GM-1 made the difference. But I lost 4 wingmen. 1 to engine detonation when his GM-1 mixture went lean. 1 to hypoxia, passed out at 13,500 meters and never recovered. 2 to P-51s who caught them during descent when they were out of nitrous and running on a wounded engine. We traded complexity for capability. War doesn't reward complexity. It rewards who can keep more aircraft in the air longer, simpler. The Americans understood that. We didn't. He paused. But those 7 kills, when it worked, when everything aligned, altitude, oxygen, temperature, enemy position, you felt like you were flying a different aircraft, superior to anything in the sky, for exactly 22 minutes. Farnborough, England, March 1943. RAF test pilot squadron leader H.J. Wilson stood beside a captured Bf-109G1, its yellow nose and Mediterranean camouflage incongruous against English drizzle. The aircraft had force-landed in Tunisia after running out of fuel, intact, complete with its GM-1 system. His orders were simple: fly it, understand it, beat it. The first test flight without GM-1 engaged revealed a fighter that matched British intelligence estimates. Fast, maneuverable, but unremarkable at altitude. Wilson climbed to 8,000 meters, the minimum GM-1 activation altitude according to captured manuals, and flipped the toggle switch. His report now declassified. Power increase was immediate and substantial. Rate of climb improved dramatically. At 12,000 meters, the aircraft maintained speeds I would not have thought possible for a single-engine piston fighter. However, the system's limitations were equally apparent. Duration approximately 20 minutes at maximum flow. Below 8,000 meters, activation resulted in rough running and excessive manifold pressure, potentially engine damaging. The strategic value is obvious but narrow. British intelligence had already intercepted Luftwaffe radio communications discussing GM-1 failures. One particularly revealing signal from November 1942 reported that an entire staffel of GM-1-equipped aircraft at Rechlin Test Center had been grounded because the nitrous delivery had frozen en route from the production facility. The weakness wasn't the technology. It was logistics. Nitrous oxide required specialized storage and handling. It couldn't be stockpiled at forward airbases without proper refrigeration equipment. It evaporated during transport. It required technical specialists to maintain the injection systems, specialists the Luftwaffe increasingly lacked as the war consumed trained personnel. Allied tactical response emerged quickly. The Americans took a different approach: out-engineer the problem. The P-51D Mustang, entering service in 1944, used a 2-stage 2-speed Packard Merlin engine with intercooling. It could maintain high power to 12,000 meters without chemical boost. Simpler, more reliable. The Mustang's weakness was range, solved with drop tanks, not chemistry. But the most devastating countermeasure was strategic. By mid-1944, Allied bombing doctrine shifted toward saturation. Instead of small formations at extreme altitude, they sent hundreds of bombers with hundreds of fighters at medium altitude where GM-1 was useless. The Luftwaffe could intercept 10 bombers with GM-1-equipped fighters and claim all 10. Meanwhile, 90 others reached their targets. Numbers beat chemistry. Captured German documents from late 1944 reveal the Luftwaffe's own assessment. GM1 production continues but operational use declining. Pilots prefer MW50 methanol water injection for low-altitude combat, or standard aircraft without boost systems to reduce weight and complexity. GM1 effectiveness limited to specialized high-altitude reconnaissance interception. Recommend production cessation unless strategic bombing altitudes increase. They didn't. The Americans refined their tactics, improved their fighters, and overwhelmed German defenses through mass production rather than technical elegance. The P-51 could escort bombers to Berlin and back. The Bf-109G1 could chase them for 22 minutes before running dry. The final irony: some sources indicate that a small number of RAF Spitfires and Mosquitoes were experimentally fitted with nitrous oxide injection systems based on captured GM1 data. But British trials concluded what the Germans had learned the hard way. The operational complexity outweighed the tactical advantage. War rewards reliability over brilliance. The GM1 system was brilliant. It just wasn't reliable enough. April 1945. The war was ending. Hermann Graf, holder of the world altitude record for piston engine fighters, 14,300 meters in a Bf-109G5 the U-2 with GM1, stood beside the wreckage of his aircraft at a captured Luftwaffe airfield. American engineers swarmed over it, photographing the GM1 system, measuring tank capacity, analyzing injection nozzles. One asked him, "Was it worth it?" Graf didn't answer immediately. He stared at the glass wool-wrapped tanks, the brass jets, the pressure regulators that had given him power nobody else possessed. "For 22 minutes, he finally said, "I owned the sky." The Americans documented everything, shipped components back to Wright Field, and promptly forgot about it. Because by 1945, the future wasn't piston engines with chemical boost. It was jets. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the Gloucester Meteor, aircraft that didn't need nitrous oxide because they didn't breathe air the same way. Turbojets compressed and burned continuously. Altitude limitations still existed, but the physics were different. GM1 became historical footnote. Until 1958. California, drag strips. Dick Flynn, a racer who'd served as an aircraft mechanic during the war, remembered captured German technical documents describing nitrous oxide injection. He adapted the principle to American V8 engines. Not for altitude performance, for acceleration. The chemistry was identical. The application was revolutionary. Nitrous oxide injection exploded into hot rodding culture. Companies formed: NOS, Nitrous Express, Edelbrock. The shot of nitrous became synonymous with instant power. Street racers, drag racers, circle track competitors, all using technology developed to chase bombers in the stratosphere for drag races lasting 10 seconds. The irony would have amused Otto Lutz. His system, designed for the most sophisticated combat application imaginable, found its largest success making muscle cars faster in straight lines. But the technical legacy runs deeper. Modern Formula One power units use energy recovery systems that inject stored electrical power into the drivetrain, conceptually similar to GM1's burst power philosophy. Military turbofan engines use water injection for short-term thrust increases during takeoff, echoing MW50 and GM1 principles. The idea of chemical boost, trading consumable resources for temporary performance, never died. It evolved. Today's performance cars use turbochargers and superchargers for sustained boost, but nitrous oxide systems still exist for that edge case, where 20 seconds of extra power justifies the complexity. Where GM1 succeeded was proving the concept. You can extract more power from an engine than its design intended if you're willing to accept limitations. Where it failed was being too complex for the war that actually happened. The Luftwaffe needed simple, mass-producible fighters that could be flown by minimally trained pilots and maintained by mechanics with basic tools. GM1 was the opposite. Complex, temperamental, requiring specialists and infrastructure and perfect conditions. But for the pilots who mastered it, who understood the narrow window where it gave them superiority, GM1 represented something profound. The belief that engineering could overcome physics, that chemistry could rewrite the rules. For 22 minutes they were right. After that they were just another fighter. except heavier. And running out of fuel, Rudolf Klein, the pilot whose combat we witnessed, survived to fly jets. In a 1987 interview, he said, "People ask if GM1 made us better pilots. No, it made us different pilots. We thought in minutes instead of tactics. We counted grams instead of enemies. We became engineers in combat. Maybe that's why we lost. The Americans were pilots who fought. We were pilots who calculated." The last GM1 equipped Bf-109 flew in combat in March 1945, intercepting a lone reconnaissance Mosquito at 13,200 meters. The pilot engaged successfully, damaged the Mosquito, then ran out of nitrous and fuel simultaneously. He glided 30 kilometers and belly-landed in a field. The Americans captured him 6 hours later. They asked about his aircraft. He explained GM1. They wrote it down, filed it, and forgot it, until someone in California remembered.